Hi, I'm Craig the geologist, and in previous episodes here at Rockport, we've explored the fossils and learned about the ancient environment here. This location used to be an enormous Caribbean-style sea with Bahamas-style islands all around, but that's 390 million years ago when we were on the equator and life was totally different. We've gotten a close-up look at about a half dozen different species of fossil and learned how to identify them. We've walked the shores of an ancient buried island. So join me today as we finish up our exploration of that island and the fossils it has to offer and move down into the coral reefs, where we're going to learn about life there and how to identify those fossils as well. So come join me. The previous episode concluded with my promise to move several inches to the right from where I sat as we explored the shoreline of this ancient buried island. So let's do that. A few inches indeed. I did not go very far. I could not find my knee pads today, so maybe hurting a little bit. A whole bunch of fossils over here. Maybe another Strophomana here. That little spike or wing you see on the side, maybe it's a Strophodonta. I'm telling you, there are a lot of very similar looking species with very similar names that are biologically, hey, very similar to each other. Yikes. Look at the dramatic and distinctive curve to the shell. This is a dramatically curved brachiopod shell, and that leads me to believe that what we're looking at here is Desquamatia. You know, at the end of this video, I should put together some sort of torturous, tongue-twisting rhyme with all these brachiopod names. But Desquamatia is actually one of the most common varieties of brachiopod in the Devonian era. We don't see quite so much of them out here at Rockport, but apparently across North America, they are very widespread during this time range. Now over here, take a look at this. Look how shiny this is. What you're seeing here is the preserved interior of the shells, the nacre. The nacre is the mother of pearl interior of these organisms, of these shells. And even after 390 million years, it's still preserved. Hey, look at this guy. This is one of the rare varieties that I can recognize and identify without having to consult a guidebook. This is a variety of brachiopod that you find commonly out at Rockport called Schizophoria farronensis. And yes, you heard me use two names. I used the actual species name besides the genera name. I'm able to get that detailed because I know it. Yay, I'm proud of myself. Yes, that's me bragging. Now this looks very flat. But that's because we only have half of the fossil. If it was complete, you would realize that this is actually a very chonky boy. This is a piece that I have at home, and take a look at the way you have a very flat side here and then you flip it over and it is just so dramatically curved. It should be super obvious to you that we're looking at a brachiopod variety here. Each shell is symmetric on its left and right sides. It has left-right bilateral symmetry, but the shells themselves are asymmetric with each other. That is, they are not the same shape. You take a look at what we'll call the top shell and the bottom shell. These have wildly different shapes. So that means it's not a bivalve. Bivalves are symmetric between their shells, but maybe asymmetric between their left and right sides. And brachiopods are the opposite case. Brachiopods have left-right symmetry, but their shells are asymmetric with one another. But I love these brachiopods, these Schizophora. They just have such a fun body shape. Hey, maybe they make me feel better about my body shape. the ground is just littered with shell fossils everywhere. Some not that great, kind of poor condition. A lot of weathering on them, some spectacular. There we go. Oh, well, this guy's just barely peeking out. Here's the interior of that shell. Just shells on shells on shells out here. This looks like relatively fresh debris from recent rains. But I'm not seeing too many shells in that. All right. Another shell interior here. Several shell interiors. You wouldn't know it from up here. It's just a fossil soup. But I have some crinoid stems and shell fragments, but got some big shells down there. Oh, this is all shell here. This is crazy. Oh, it's all very broken up though. I see some crinoid stems. Lots of tiny shell fragments. Not seeing any real big intact shells over this section. Well, stuff like that. Let's come down towards the bottom of the slope and see if we find anything down there. Lots of fossil soup style rocks here. Lots of them. There's bryozoan peeking out there. Oh, this one's a shell fossil soup. Got all those shell fragments in there. Got here a little piece of horn coral. And something else caught my eye off. Shell fragment there. Yeah. Let's keep making our way down. Anything over here to capture our attention? Oh. I have a little piece of what might be Favosites coral. Although, to be honest, some of the corals can look similar enough to me that I have a hard time with them. Some more dramatic fossil soup style rocks here. A lot of everything in there. Yeah, I think over here we're just finding more of the same shell fossils. I think it's time to move on to a different part of the quarry. All right, let's gather up my bag and go. Well, let's have a look over here, shall we? Now, in quarries, you do find discarding mining debris, as well as signs that teenagers have been out here on a weekend. It's a quarry. But let's have a look for some more natural stuff here. It's a big block that was blasted out. And in these very shaly layers, we're finding lots of fossils. Now, I often call these horn corals, but I believe most of these are actually Cladopora. Cladopora is a variety of coral. Cladopora are branching corals. Now, they can be flat or massive, but you're mostly going to see branching structures. And what you're going to see is not full branching organisms, but small branch segments, as you're seeing right up in here. They're members of the Favosites family. That means that they are very closely related to the Favosites corals. So you're going to be looking for corallites, those small circular or hexagonal openings that the coral polyps lived in, to be looking almost exactly the same as they do for Charlevoix stones for Favosites corals. Unlike Favosites corals that mostly form bulbous, more circular, classic shaped corals, you're going to be looking for branch segments for these. Let's have a look at the other side here. Now, these muddy layers would have probably been deposited during or just after storms. Pretty big storms probably, runoff from nearby continental shelf or nearby landmass of some sort. And so it might make sense that there are so many broken fossil fragments lying down in those deposits, because when you have a big storm, the water gets churned up. You get a lot of devastation on the seafloor. See what else we happen to have nearby. Now, this is just blasted out material here, none of it's information, so we can't draw any conclusions based on rocks that are next to each other about the environment. Looks like we got some bryozoans in there. And not a whole lot else I want to talk about right here. Let's move on a bit further. Now, when you're rock hounding out here, perhaps rock hounding isn't the right word. I encountered a couple out here a little bit earlier today who were out for true rock hounding. They walked into the quarry and then walked out 5 minutes later and said, "Well, there aren't any colorful rocks here." I said, "No, there wouldn't be in a limestone quarry. We'll call it fossil hounding." That does not roll off the tongue. Nothing's rolling off my tongue today. But when you're out here hunting for fossils, the easiest way to travel is on these old quarry roads that still exist here. But the best way to find good fossils is to trek out directly across those ridges. Now, it is exhausting to walk up and down over those ridges, watching your footing every time. It can be dangerous if you have any kind of mobility issues. If you're more than about 5 years older than myself, I recommend limiting the amount you walk over those piles. But going over those ridges, that's where you're going to encounter everything. So easy path here, but very little to find. Nightmare path out there, but an infinite number of fossils. I don't know why I stopped recording it. Might as well kept recording because this is the point at which I'm going to take the difficult path and try to find you some nice stuff out here. Got some shaly bits right here with more of what we just got done looking at. Probably Cladopora. We'll have a look at this guy, and let me try to film it in such a way that it's not in my shadow. Well, I may not be an expert on Cladopora. This has got to be a horn coral. Look at that. Beautiful shape on that horn coral. It would have been anchored to the ground just at this tiny little point here, and it grows up. It's got that nice classic slight curve to it. Horn corals mostly have that. I don't think they all have that, but most of them do. Beautiful horn coral in there. Horn corals were solitary corals, unlike most of the corals we're familiar with today that are colonial, and there were many colonial varieties like Favosites and Hexoganaria back during the Devonian. Horn corals were solitary. It was a single polyp secreting its own home. Horn corals are in the Rugosa family, so a more scientific name for horn coral is Rugosa coral. We don't usually worry about identifying the specific species of horn coral when we find it, but this is probably Heterophrenitis. Heterophrenitis was widespread across North America during the Devonian, and so that makes it the most likely guy here. The shape, everything looks like a good match for Heterophrenitis or a closely related species. One interesting thing about Heterophrenitis, though, is that it grew not by extending its shell upward and out, but by adding new layers to its base and raising itself from the seafloor, which apparently helped keep it light. The rest of that likely be Cladopora fossils. And that one's not showing enough for me to draw any conclusions. Here we go. There we are. All right. I believe that's a Cladopora right there. A bunch of rhizoan fragments up here likely. Let's go over some more ridges. So you'll notice that those kind of shaly rocks with horn coral and Cladopora all scattered throughout it are actually very common out here. Not great for collecting unless you're coming out here with a tractor. I know you're not allowed to do that. This is DNR land. It is not a state park. As I understand it, it's a state recreation area, which is a little bit poorly defined. But you are limited to 20 pounds per year. It's not 20 pounds per year per site. It's 20 pounds per year total across Michigan public lands. Look at that nice big horn coral there. This is broken up here. I wonder if there's anything interesting to look at in there. Well, this is what I've got a rock hammer for. I'm not going to dig my chisel up for that, but I'm going to try to pry that apart with the rock hammer and see if we can't come on now. Anything interesting? It looks like the answer is going to be no. Looks like we got a pocket, some rusted out pyrite in there. Other than that, I don't think there's anything terribly interesting going on in there. Now, a lot of people, when they first get a rock hammer, start breaking open random rocks because they think, well, there's going to be a piece of treasure inside every one. There really isn't. Mostly just want to use it for cases where you're pretty sure there's something cool inside that you're not seeing. This is some patterning that I just don't know what's going on there. It's kind of cool. Weird texture. Here are the classic hummocks of a stromatoporoid. I don't know if you noticed this colorful, ugly piece, but this is coal slag. The machinery they had out here working was coal powered, and so you do find these slag fragments in places, and sometimes entire piles of it. But yeah, this is just slag from the old coal powered mining equipment they used out here back in the olden days. And yeah, here got some rusted out pyrite here, iron concretion, probably taking the form of something biologic that was once there. Iron in rocks is attracted to carbon, and so biologic material often attracts carbon and serves as a focal point for iron concretions. Here we go. This probably isn't going to be the best one we find all day, but we have a coral here. Oh, actually we've got two corals here, so let's talk about each of these guys. First, let's talk about this big one. This is a Petoskey Stone, Hexoganaria coral. Can't see those hexagons very well up there, but I've seen enough of these guys out here to be able to be pretty confident with the identification on that. Like the other corals, it grows from a point and flares out. The anchor point for the Hexoganaria corals tends to be a bit wider than you see for the horn corals and some of the other guys out here. Now, this little guy here, it's a big rock, but look at these little round circles here. That's a Favosites coral. So over here you got your Petoskey Stone, over here you got your Charlevoix stone. That's also a coral, just a different variety.
Favosites corals are often referred to as Charlevoix stones in Michigan, whereas the Hexoganaria corals are commonly referred to as Petoskey stones, both in Michigan and pretty much everywhere, because once they're polished, they become gorgeous, and it is the state stone of Michigan. The Hexoganaria coral that we're looking at here, we're getting a side view. Here's a piece where you're getting a view of the top, and here you can see those nice hexagonal coral lights on it. Coral lights, of course, are the homes that the individual coral polyps lived in. Favosites and Hexoganaria are both colonial corals. So if Rugosa corals, if horn corals were the corals that like to be living in their own little homestead, 100 miles from their nearest neighbor, these guys are city dwellers. They like to be packed into small apartments, real close together. Now there is an advantage to that, and that should be obvious from the fact that horn corals don't exist today, but colonial corals are very abundant to this day. And there's defense, there's just having the larger structure to grow on. But also in the Favosites corals, we have found holes in many of the corallite walls where the individual polyps would share nutrients with their neighbors. These were sort of communist corals. They would collect, passing particles and eat them. But if they had more than they needed, they would just openly share it with their neighbors. Favosites can be distinguished from Hexoganaria pretty easily, and it can be distinguished from the shape of the corallites and the size. The corallites on a Hexoganaria, on a Petoskey stone, they are hexagonal, and they tend to be pretty large, whereas the corallites on a Charlevoix are circular and very small. Hexoganaria corals and Favosites corals, along with Cladopora. These were all neighbors. They all lived at the same time in the same environment, probably competing directly against each other. We got down here, we got some bryozoans. Over here we got a piece of Charlevoix stone. Yeah, Favosites coral, I believe. It's got that look to it. See, the more I sit here, the more I see lots of little fragments all over. Let's continue on. I just got up and noticed the rock I was sitting on. It is a very complicated, interesting mess of fossils. I swear to God, every time I turn off my camera, I see something else. So we just saw the side-on view of the Hexoganaria Petoskey Stone coral. Well, this is your top view of it. This is not a perfect top-on view. You'll see they're a bit elongated, so we're getting kind of a not a clean perpendicular slice through it. We're seeing a kind of an angled cut through it. There are those nice hexagons. They're colonial corals. Some coral species, like horn corals, grow individually. They're your loners. They're the guys who like to have a homestead out in the woods. And then you got your city dwellers, your colonial corals, where they pack in as tightly with one another as possible. And that's your Hexoganaria and your Favosites. What have we got here? We can see these growth rings growing outward, so we know it's biologic. I see tiny pore spaces in there. So this is likely to be a section of stromatoporoid sponge. There were different species of stromatoporoid. It wasn't just a single species across the planet. They grow in slightly different shapes and pack in different ways. Look at that bit of rusted pyrite there. Pretty cool as well. A lot there. Yeah, those you should be able to recognize those growth rings on that. Pretty neat. Join me next week as we conclude this Rockport exploration, discover a few more fossils, and start digging into some of the shales where you find a lot fewer fossils, but at the same time, the fossils are far more exotic. It'll be a lot of fun. I'll see you then.